Laurie comes to us as a longtime Old Testament scholar, teaching some in the Church of Nazarene, also at Judson, I believe it was. And
Yes.
his essay in the book, as an Old Testament scholar, addresses especially the questions of Sodom and Gomorrah. So, what's your key issue you want to talk about this evening?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and to Alexa as well for the great job you've done. I've been deeply impacted by this book and this group, but my presentation is going to be a little bit different from anything that's gone on before. I decided to write down a couple conclusions for what I want you all to take away that relates to this project, and the very first one is that the Sodom and Gomorrah story doesn't really have any relevance to the discussion of same-sex relations. You know, it keeps coming up, but it really doesn't have any relevance. And this is not new. My findings reinforce that, but even without what I wrote, I think this should be common knowledge. And the other thing I wanted to highlight, after I wrote my essay and began to look at, okay, why has everybody interpreted the Sodom and Gomorrah story, especially the three passages that I look at, the three verses, why have they always interpreted it differently from the way I've just read it, is they've had wrong conclusions based on false assumptions about the story, English translations. And at the time, I just looked at a couple. I looked at the most used, the NRSV and the NIV. Afterwards, I went down a rabbit hole and looked at about 30 English translations. I discovered that up until about 1922, all of the English translations were basically correct, and there was a sudden shift. And then I went down another rabbit hole to find out why that was so, which I probably won't be able to get to tonight. But faulty translations, for about the last 100 years, there was a shift in the translations. So the false assumptions I listed four. The first false assumption, which both sides of the argument often make, is that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is completely illustrated by the action of the men who encounter Lot's guests. That explains the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's really no basis for that understanding. And then a related mistake is to assume that the men's sin is same-sex relations and not homosexual rape, or whatever you want to call that. And so that's the first one. The second one, which is, I think the thing that when I discovered it, I was the most surprised. When I went into writing this essay, I had no idea that I was going to find this, that outsiders complaining against Sodom and Gomorrah's sin is not what the text says. That's a false assumption. We read the text and it looks like people are complaining about the sin or the actions of Sodom and Gomorrah. And a close reading of the three verses that I look at just show that isn't so. The third assumption is the entire populations of Sodom and Gomorrah are wicked. And that one's going to take some unpacking, because the way the text reads, it certainly seems like that's what it's saying. And the fourth false assumption I just have come to the last couple of days as I've worked through what I'm going to say. I realized that when people read the Sodom and Gomorrah story, when interpreters present it, it's almost like they've forgotten everything they've learned about similar stories. It's almost like this is a unique story that has its own method of interpretation. But if you look at other stories where God announces divine judgment, sends messengers, and responses are made to those messengers, there's a completely different set of assumptions applied to those types of stories. I've already mentioned the faulty translation. If you want to have a good translation of Genesis 18:20, 18:21, and 19:13. Look at the King James Bible. Genesis 18:20 says, "The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great." The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great. But starting about 1922, people started translating that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, as if outsiders are complaining about it. Same thing with Genesis 18:21 and 19:13. The texts talk about its cry, the city's cry, or their cry, the city's plural cry. Most English translations now say the outcry against it. The outcry against it. So again, the King James translation, and I looked at about 30 translations going all the way back to the Geneva Bible in 1560, and they all had it correct until the turn of the 19th century. The story itself, again, assuming that the reception, the hostile reception of the men that visited Lot explains the sin, it's just not acceptable. If we read another text, say, Elijah's encounters, Amos, Jeremiah, Jesus, or the apostles, we wouldn't assume that when the messenger comes with a message that people don't want to hear, that however the messenger is treated, that illustrates the exact sin that the messenger has come to announce. Then the other thing is a plain reading of those three texts, Genesis 18, 20, 21, and 19:13. The word there is not just cry, and that's part of the problem because the translations use cry, and there's a lot of meanings that the English word cry have. But the Hebrew term is a very specific term that means a cry for help. And it is always a cry from a victim. It's from somebody who's suffered. It's from Israel suffering under Egyptian oppression. It's from Job. And as Job speaks for the poor who cry out, it's in the Psalms. It can be translated the groan of a lament. And it's often a cry to help to God, a cry. And so the cry that reaches God's ears in the Sodom and Gomorrah story isn't an accusation against these sinful cities. It's a cry from within the cities, from the oppressed, for help. And if you look at the context of a cry for help in the Old Testament, it's almost always related to social injustice, defeat in war, suffering, sickness. So it's a completely different idea. And again, I was surprised to find that. And I'm convinced that if you took a second-year Hebrew student who knew the vocabulary and had a basic understanding of Hebrew grammar, and he looked at, or she, or they looked at these passages that I just read, they would come up with the same interpretation. And they would say, wait a minute, that sounds different from what I've heard. They would look at the English translations and say, why is this? And then they'd look at the reference grammars and say, oh, okay, somebody says we should translate it this way, so we'll translate it this way. So, I mean, that's my basic argument. I have come to understand, I think, why the mistranslations are there, and I can explain why I think the older translations are correct. But I just let you ask questions at this point.
Yeah, actually, our time is up. You've given us so much material here, so we're gonna have to refer people to your article for that. And if they have any questions, if you want to just monitor the chat, you might be able to respond to some.
Okay, personal message me. Or...
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks so much, Laurie.
Thank you.
Really important stuff. I could talk about this for a couple hours, but unfortunately we've run out of time.